Samantha stood by the kitchen sink, absently swirling the last drops of coffee in her mug. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the room, its rhythm contrasting with the silence in the rest of the house. She glanced at the clock. Nearly 8 a.m. David had already left for work, as usual, without so much as a goodbye. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air, a reminder of his presence, even if it felt like he hadn't truly been there in years. She sighed, setting the mug down. The leak in the kitchen sink had worsened overnight, a steady drip, drip, drip now echoing louder than her thoughts. Samantha had tried tightening the faucet herself, but it only made things worse. With a resigned shrug, she picked up her phone and scrolled through the list of recommended plumbers on the neighborhood app. Jake's Plumbing Services. She read aloud, the accompanying reviews glowing with praise. Fast, professional, trustworthy. She tapped the number and dialed. Within an hour, Jake arrived. The sound of his truck pulling into the driveway broke the monotony of her morning. Samantha peeked through the curtains, noting the man stepping out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a confident gait, Jake carried a toolbox in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He wore a simple navy shirt and jeans, his sun-weathered face framed by salt and pepper hair. "Morning," he greeted, his voice warm but businesslike as Samantha opened the door. His gaze met hers, steady and unhurried, and for a moment, she felt an odd flicker of self-consciousness. "Hi, thanks for coming on such short notice," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Jake surveyed the kitchen with a professional eye. "This the culprit?" he asked, nodding toward the sink. "Yeah, it started leaking a few days ago, but now it's relentless." Samantha crossed her arms, the corners of her mouth twitching into a weak smile. "I tried fixing it myself, but I think I just made it worse." Jake chuckled, crouching to inspect the pipe beneath the sink. "Happens all the time. Sometimes these things just need the right touch." Samantha watched as he worked, his movements efficient yet unhurried. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the occasional clink of tools and his murmured observations. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a strange sense of ease in his presence, as though his steady demeanor had momentarily smoothed the edges of her fraying nerves. "You've got a nice setup here," Jake said, glancing around the kitchen. "Modern but not cold. I like that. Thanks. I tried to make it feel like home," Samantha replied, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. She hesitated, then added, "Not that anyone seems to notice these days." Jake straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held a flicker of understanding. "That's so." Samantha regretted the comment instantly. "Oh, it's nothing. Just life, I guess. Busy schedules. You know how it is." She waved a hand dismissively, as though brushing away the subject. "Yeah," Jake said after a moment, his tone even. "But it's important to notice the little things. They add up." His words lingered in the air, heavier than Samantha expected. She busied herself by tidying the counter, but her mind replayed the sentiment. When was the last time David noticed anything about her? A new dress, a change in hairstyle, even the small touches she added to their home? Jake's voice broke her reverie. "Looks like the main issue's a worn-out seal. I'll replace it and tighten the fittings. Shouldn't take long." "Great, thank you," she said, grateful for the return to practical matters. As Jake worked, they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. He shared snippets about his day-to-day life as a plumber. Long hours, odd jobs, the occasional laughable mishap. Samantha found herself laughing along, her laughter genuine for the first time in weeks. "You ever deal with something like this before?" he asked, holding up the worn seal for her to see. "Not exactly," she admitted, "but I'm getting used to things falling apart." Jake didn't press further, but the glance he gave her carried weight. "Well, some things are easier to fix than others. This, at least, won't give you trouble for a while." He finished the repair, testing the faucet to ensure the leak was gone. "All set," he announced, packing up his tools. "If you have any other issues, don't hesitate to call." Samantha followed him to the door, feeling an unexpected pang of reluctance as he prepared to leave. "Thanks again," she said. "I really appreciate it." Jake paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Take care of yourself, Samantha," he said softly, his tone layered with something she couldn't quite define. She watched as he walked back to his truck, her thoughts swirling. The house felt emptier than before, the silence now carrying an edge she hadn't noticed until today. As the sound of Jake's truck faded into the distance, Samantha leaned against the doorframe, her eyes falling to the repaired sink. The leak was gone, but the cracks beneath the surface of her life remained. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if they could ever truly be fixed. Samantha stirred the pasta in the pot, her thoughts elsewhere as steam curled around her face. The scent of garlic and basil filled the kitchen, yet the room felt lifeless. She glanced at the dining table, set for two, but always feeling like one. David had texted earlier, running late. Don't wait up. Her grip on the wooden spoon tightened. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Dinner, once a cherished time to connect, had become another routine stripped of meaning. The sharp sound of water dripping snapped her out of her thoughts. Her eyes darted to the sink. The faint rhythm was unmistakable, drip, drip, drip. She walked over and bent down, pressing her fingers against the edge of the cabinet. A tiny pool of water was forming beneath the pipes. "Are you kidding me?" she muttered, grabbing a towel to mop up the mess. The leak was back, mocking her attempt to maintain control over at least one part of her life. She hesitated, then reached for her phone, scrolling to Jake's number in her recent calls. He answered on the second ring. Jake's Plumbing Services. "Hi, Jake. This is Samantha. You came by earlier this week for the leak in my kitchen." "Of course. Everything all right?" "Not exactly." She sighed. "The leak's back. I think it's worse this time." Jake's voice softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'll come by first thing tomorrow if that works for you." "That would be great. Thanks." The call ended, leaving Samantha staring at her phone. Something about Jake's calm assurance settled her nerves in a way she hadn't expected. She placed the phone down and returned to her dinner preparations, though her appetite had vanished. The next morning, Jake arrived promptly at 9. Samantha opened the door, surprised by the wave of relief she felt at seeing him again. "Morning," he greeted with a smile. "Morning. Thanks for coming so quickly." "Not a problem," he said, stepping inside. "Let's take another look at that sink." As Jake knelt by the cabinet, his hands deftly unscrewing the fittings, Samantha found herself studying him. There was something reassuring about the way he moved, as though he approached every task with purpose and care. "Looks like there's a secondary issue here," he said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "The pipe's corroded. Might have been overlooked the first time. I'll have to replace this section." Samantha crouched beside him, watching as he pointed to the problem. "Is it going to be a big job?" "Not too big, but it'll take some time." "Do you mind if I get started now?" "Go ahead," she said, standing up. "Can I get you some coffee while you work?" "Sure. Black if you've got it." As Samantha busied herself making coffee, Jake's presence filled the kitchen in a way she hadn't realized she missed. The air seemed lighter, the silence less oppressive. When she handed him the mug, their fingers brushed briefly, sending a jolt of awareness through her. "Thanks," Jake said, his voice quiet but steady. She leaned against the counter, watching him work. "You must meet a lot of people doing this job." Jake glanced up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I do. Every house has a story, and every leak has a reason. People are usually pretty open when something's broken. They let their guard down." "That's an interesting way of looking at it." Jake shrugged. "Fixing pipes is the easy part. It's the people that make the job worth it." Samantha felt a pang of envy at his words. When was the last time someone had truly noticed her, let alone found her worth their time? Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as Jake worked, his presence drawing out a side of Samantha she hadn't felt in years. He made her laugh, a sound that felt foreign and familiar all at once. "You got a good laugh," Jake said suddenly, his tone casual but sincere. Samantha's cheeks flushed. "Thanks. I don't use it much these days." Jake paused, meeting her eyes. "Maybe you should." For a moment, the air between them felt charged, a quiet intensity that neither seemed willing to break. Then Jake looked back at the pipe, the moment passing but leaving a trace behind. When he finally finished, Jake stood and wiped his hands on a towel. "All done. This should hold for good now." "Thank you," Samantha said, meaning it more than she expected. Jake packed up his tools, but lingered by the door. If anything else comes up, don't hesitate to call. And not just for the plumbing. Samantha blinked, caught off guard by the openness in his tone. She nodded, her voice catching slightly. I'll keep that in mind. As he left, Samantha stood in the doorway, watching until his truck disappeared down the street. She closed the door, her fingers brushing the frame as though grounding herself. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now, less empty, more alive. For the first time in a long while, Samantha felt something stir within her, something she couldn't quite name. And as the sound of silence returned, it carried the faintest promise of change. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow over the polished counters and tiled floor. Samantha sat at the table, absent-mindedly thumbing through an old magazine. Her mind wasn't on the glossy pages, nor on the faint murmur of the television in the living room. Instead, it lingered on the faint traces Jake had left behind. The scent of his cologne still clung to the air, mingling with the fresh scent of coffee she'd brewed earlier. She glanced at the sink, now fixed and silent, a small victory in the otherwise crumbling state of her life. The thought brought a bitter smile to her lips. Of all the things in her world, a leaking pipe had been the easiest to mend. The sound of a car door slamming pulled her from her thoughts. Rising, she moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. Her breath caught as she saw Jake stepping out of his truck. He was holding a small black case, his expression thoughtful as he approached the door. Samantha opened it before he could knock. "Jake, sorry to drop by unannounced," he said, his tone apologetic yet firm. "I realized I left a tool here earlier. Mind if I grab it?" "Oh, of course." She stepped aside, her heart racing at his unexpected arrival. Jake entered, his presence immediately filling the space. He set the black case on the counter and began scanning the area near the sink. "Shouldn't take long," he said, his voice grounding calm. "It's no problem," Samantha replied, folding her arms across her chest. She felt an odd mix of comfort and nervousness, her emotions tangling in ways she hadn't expected. As Jake located the missing tool, a small wrench tucked behind the cabinet, he turned to her with a smile. "Found it. Sorry for the intrusion." "It's not an intrusion," Samantha said quickly, then hesitated. "Actually, it's kind of nice to have company." Jake paused, his eyes searching hers for a moment. "You don't get much of that, do you?" The question struck deeper than she anticipated. "Not really," she admitted softly. "David's always busy, and when he's home, it's like we're just occupying the same space. Not really living together." Jake leaned against the counter, his expression neutral but attentive. "That sounds lonely." "It is," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down, ashamed at how easily the words had slipped out. "I'm sorry, Samantha," Jake said after a moment. His tone was sincere, not pitying, and it made her throat tighten. "It's not your fault," she said, forcing a smile. "I guess it's just how things are." Jake's gaze didn't waver. "That doesn't mean it's how things have to stay." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Samantha felt a lump rise in her throat, a mixture of hope and fear she couldn't quite name. "Jake," she began, but the words failed her. "I'm not trying to step where I don't belong," he said gently, his voice steady. "But I know what it's like to feel invisible. And I know you don't deserve that." Her breath hitched at the raw honesty in his tone. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in years, she felt truly seen. The moment stretched between them, the silence charged with something Samantha couldn't deny. Her pulse quickened as Jake took a small step closer, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the black case on the counter. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver up her spine. "I should go," Jake said, his voice low. Samantha nodded, though her heart screamed otherwise. "Thank you. For everything." Jake hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "If you ever need anything at all, you've got my number." "I know," she said softly. He opened the door, the evening air rushing in as he stepped outside. Samantha watched as he climbed into his truck, her chest tightening as the engine roared to life. She stood in the doorway long after he drove away, the weight of his words and the intensity of his gaze lingering in her mind. As she closed the door, The house felt different. The silence wasn't oppressive this time. It was expectant, as though something had shifted within her. Samantha leaned against the door, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest stirrings of something she thought she'd lost: desire, hope, and the spark of possibility. And though she didn't know what would come next, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't ready to let it go.